Okay, Sergey, can you start today's meeting with the PR status review?
Okay. Should I say that the SIG Node weekly meeting it's September 22nd? This week we still making progress. We still downtrending on PR number. I just checked statistics on latest on a PR for 2 years, and we almost at the level of PR number from last year. We are not even close to 2 years back because that level was like around 40, 50 PRs active. Last year was around 148 number, so we can get close to that. I hope we can, we have 4 more weeks, and if we have a trend of decreasing 10 at least a week, that will be very, very good. And I looked at number of inactive PRs, the same dev stats, and inactive PRs is way low. So we try to poke all the PRs very actively. So hopefully we can, it will help to decrease number as well. And we can close all the inactive ones and get to the good numbers. Yeah, this week I looked at rotten PRs. There are 2 that seems useful. So if you have energy to just revitalize them, just do it. Thank you.
Thank you, Sergey, for keeping us honest here. Yeah, Derek, do you want to get to the next topic for enhancement in the coming release?
Yeah, so I know much of today's agenda is tied up on KEP reviews. The ask I was just having is if we can get every KEP enumerated that we want reviewed this week, even if it's ideally in this agenda doc, that's great, and we can ensure we pair up a reviewer with that KEP. The freeze is, I think October 4th, maybe it's the 2nd. It's somewhere in the first week of October.
It's the 6th.
It's the 2nd?
6th.
Oh, 6th?
6th. Yeah.
Thank you, Kirsten. And so I think if we allow this week to get some reviews done, we'll have time for iteration and still meet that 6th deadline. But 2 weeks out or so from the enhancements freeze, I just want to make sure that people are aware of the upcoming date. Absent that, I guess we can go on individual KEPs. For the items that we raised last week that I said I wasn't able to review until this week, the sidecar container KEP, I apologize, I haven't read yet. I did get through the memory manager KEP. And so that sidecar one is next. But if we want to go through the other remaining KEPs now, I think maybe others have had a chance to read and comment or want to talk through them.
Would it be okay if I just said something really quick? I'm Kirsten, and I'm the enhancements lead for 1.20, and we're basically trying to be super proactive this cycle so that things don't get stuck towards the end. So we started pinging all of the KEPs early, and a lot of people have been super responsive. If you have something that needs to go in, then it'd be great to respond to any pings that are on the issues, because that's how the team tracks it. We've also been emphasizing to people opening KEPs that they need to talk to the SIG first. And we've actually added that into the issue template so that, we just don't get flooded with people who thought that they had a great idea without actually talking to the sponsoring SIG. So if you have any questions, totally reach out to me. If you have any problems, reach out to me. And I'm sure you'll hear from me again on all of your PRs and issues. So that's all.
There's the fact, is there any the enhancement still need of the reviewer? We do have the owner, but still need a reviewer. Do you have any?
So I think we should make sure as we go through the rest of the agenda that we have a clear reviewer. So at least for the ones that are listed here now, both Kevin and myself were reviewing the memory manager KEP, but of course we'd love more eyeballs on it. And then the sidecar KEP I had said I would take shepherding on. So it's the remaining KEPs. If we go through here, just the agenda, I'll make sure we have a clear assigner for, or an understanding on if it's something we can actually implement in this phase or not, or what our goal would be with the KEP. So maybe we want to go to the next topic, if it's okay, Dawn, like the user namespaces KEP. If
Derek, can I ask you a question just before that?
Yeah.
Not sure I follow. So you will review soon, and if it all is okay, we maybe add it to the 1.20 milestone, or how do you want to do that?
Right. I haven't read your latest update to the sidecar KEP, but it was my agenda item this afternoon to do. And so I'm assuming if that KEP was agreeable, we'd want to proceed on alpha implementation in 120 if you were
okay, perfect.
able to do that.
Yeah, I'm totally able to do that. I'm willing to do that. Thank you.
But I guess I would say if they were KEPs that we're just trying to get design consensus around, but we don't necessarily want to make implementation progress on in 120, we should just call that out as we get through some of these topics.
Thanks a lot.
So is there somebody available that wants to talk through the user namespaces KEP?
Yes, sure, I am. Can I share the screen, please? Do I have the rights to do that? Okay, I'm not able to share my screen. I need the permissions to do that.
Let me get Gwen here. Yeah.
Thank you.
You can share. You can share your screen.
Okay, thank you. Just a sec. Okay, are you able to see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, so we had been working on this for a while. We had talking to some Red Hat folks, and we at Kinefol had been working on this. So what we would like to propose is to add support for user namespaces in the Kubernetes. We want to protect, what we want to do with this is to protect cluster and other pods from malicious or compromised pods. The user namespaces feature allows to increase the host to pod and the pod to pod isolation. And I think this is not a secret for us that there are many security issues that could be mitigated if user namespace are in place. I don't want to go into all these issues, but these are some of the CVEs that could have been mitigated if user namespace were used. So what we are proposing, or what we would like to propose, is to extend the pod specification to have this new user namespace mode that has 3 different options, 3 different ways of enabling user namespaces. So we have host, we have cluster, and we have pod. I'm going into details of that just in a second. So the host mode is just the current behavior we have. This is just to share the host user namespace with the processes running inside the container, inside the pods. This case is useful for applications that don't work with user namespaces. The Linux kernel performs the capabilities check, taking into consideration the user namespaces. So there are some special capabilities that are not compatible with user namespaces. So those applications will have to share the host user namespace to work. And the same happens for privileged containers. This is the current behavior we have in Kubernetes, and we think this should be the default mode for the time being to avoid breaking existing workloads. we have a second mode that we would like to propose, and this is cluster. So in this mode, all the pods share the same ID mapping. This ID mapping is defined in the kubelet configuration. And yes, this is just a detail that the pods are in different user namespaces, but they are using actually the same ID mapping. So this mode is useful to allow to share volumes. And what happens here is that if there is a volume that is shared by different pods, those pods will be able to share files on that volume because they affect the user ID and group ID on the host is the same. So there are not going to be permission issues accessing those files. We think this is like a temporary solution until there is some support for something like a chief ID or similar solution on the Linux kernel to be able to use pods with different non-overlapping mappings and have the same ID, and at the same time have the same ID on the host. The third one mode that we would like to propose is this pod mode. So in this case, each pod gets a different ID mapping. These ID mappings are chosen by the kubelet. So the kubelet ensures that each pod gets a different non-overlapping mapping. This is the mode that actually provides effective pod-to-pod isolation because all the pods are using different ranges that don't overlap. So this makes the cross-pods attacks very less likely. This mode is suitable to be used for stateless workloads because those workloads don't have volume, so we don't have to handle the volume access issues with different mappings. We think that this should be the default mode in the future, in the long term. What I mean is that once the Linux kernel has all the features that we need to achieve the UID, GID, and so on, this should be the mode that is default for all the pods. We are proposing these changes to the CRI, so we will have to extend the CRI to contain the information about the user namespaces. We want to do two specific modifications. The first one is to add a new user field in the namespace mode. So this user field will indicate if the user namespace mode to use for the container is a different one, a new one, or if that user namespace is the same of the host. So the Bailey values for that will be pod. It means all the containers on the same pod will share the same user namespace. And host, the host user namespace is shared. This is just a detail important to notice that the cluster mode that I explained for the pod specification is not relevant at this point because this is just a special case of the pod. The only difference here is that all the pods using this cluster mode are going to share the same ID mappings. And of course,
in the cluster mode,
sure.
Where is that ID mapping stored? And then what would be the impact of somebody running cluster mode, where I think you said the behavior was intending you to be able to reuse volumes? I'm just thinking about situations with tools like Valero that allow you to maybe swing a volume from one cluster to the other one. And so I'm just curious where the mapping is persisted.
Yes, the idea is that this mapping is a cluster-wide configuration. So we are not still sure if the configuration should be on the kubelet or if we should configure this globally. But the idea is that all the cluster, the whole cluster is using the same value. But yes, for handling volumes between different clusters, we haven't considered that case yet.
I'm still, I may have the network problem, so it's your sentence a little bit broken for me. But I'm still confusing about the cluster mapping. You say that every pod share the same ID. Is that so? All those pods, it is have in this cluster mode, and are they? So they don't have any like isolation they provided. So I'm confusing by that cluster level of the mode.
Okay, so yes, in the cluster mode, there all the pods that are running on the cluster mode share the same mapping. So here there is something like an isolation between those pods and the host, but yes, there is no isolation between those pods using the cluster mode because there will be using the same mapping on the host.
When we previously explored this on with Vikas's work around user namespace remapping, I guess I'm kind of reading the cluster mode as there was a capability in Docker that allowed you to do a default remapping that all containers got. And so it was opaque to the cluster what that mapping was, I think, back when we explored this. But this is basically saying, rather than pick up a default remapping that might have been configured at the runtime level, what I'm reading this as saying is that you could have a default remapping that is controlled by the kubelet rather than implied by the container runtime.
Yes, that's right. That's the idea.
Then how you are going to manage the different Kubernetes to pick up the different mapping for the different parts in here? Do we have the policy? Do we have like the rule how we're going to do all the Kubernetes? Based on what you present, it sounds like it's kind of a static deployment to all the Kubernetes, and so they understand the same mapping. And but from what Derek explained, sounds like there could be like still configurable at the cluster creation time or manage or whatever operational time, so still could be reconfigured, and but that authority assigned to the Kubernetes. So maybe I need to see the one real use cases like the giving part, and they have the one and how they're going to share that mapping, the cluster mode of the mapping.
Yes, you are right. Actually, to be honest, this is an idea we know that somehow the pods will have to share the same mapping, but yes, this is an open discussion where to configure that mapping and how to configure that mapping. A possibility should be to make this static and to configure that just a cluster creation. That could be an option. Another option is to have that configuration on each kubelet instance. But in this case, there is the risk if the user doesn't configure that correctly, there are going to be some issues because different pods using cluster mode will be using different mappings on different nodes.
Hi, sorry. I'm Rodrigo. I'm working with Mauricio also. And maybe something that that wasn't stressed enough is that each pod will have even in cluster mode, each pod will have a different user namespace, but the mapping, so the effective user ID seen from the host point of view will be the same. So there will be some isolation, just from the host point of view, it will be the same mapping. And and basically this simple mode achieves a lot from the security point of view because there are different user namespaces and root on the container is not root on the host and those things. And the idea was just to use a static mapping. So answering your question, Don, on how the algorithm to pick a mapping would be, it would be to select a mapping in the Linux kernel, you just need to pick the container ID, the host ID. So for example, 0 in the container ID will map to 1000 in the host and the length. It will be a linear mapping. That's how the kernel allows to configure it. And so it can be just 0, 0 times 1000 or whatever it's configured in the kubelet, and for the length that you want. Something like that would be the algorithm, if I'm not missing something.
Yeah, thanks for explaining. I need to look at more on this one because I haven't have the complete picture how this is going to do. But I agree with the Mauricio, and we can talk about policy later. Yeah, this is from high level.
Yeah, sure. Actually, Yeah. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
So like right now, this is being presented as a field on the pod spec, and I was curious if you intended this to get moved under the pod security context. And then I was curious if there was a rationale for why we may or may not want a setting per container.
Okay, for the first question, I think other namespaces are configured on the pod spec. They are not configured on the security policy. So,
No,
the
I'm
security
saying off of the pod spec itself, there's a pod security context block that lets you configure what a whole
Yes.
host of options.
Yeah,
Here,
right.
like the SC Linux modes, everything else there. I would have expected that to fall into there. So that was just a minor nit. But then generally I'm asking, the second question is more interesting to me, which is, do we see a need to have a different remapping on a per container basis?
I don't think so. I think having different mappings per container will be very complicated, because if you have a volume that is shared,
So
if you have a volume on the pod and you have different containers on the same pod accessing that volume, and the mapping is different, that will be
So the
create further issues.
reason I ask is, if we do sidecar containers, if we have a world where we have secondary controllers dynamically injecting container into your pod spec unbeknownst to the user, that may want to do things like inject a volume to that pod spec, would they want to be able to control the user namespace mapping for that container and volume? So like one of the use cases for sidecar containers, if I recall, was aside from Istio, being able to have like a log, like a common logging sidecar, and I could see, or like a core dump sidecar, right? And I could see, as sidecar container use proliferates, that some of those things might bring in both a container and a PV binding that's not known to the original pod author. And it could be I'm overcomplicating that. I'm just trying to think through like this proposal with sidecar containers, if any sidecar containers would be confused by how user namespaces are set up.
So, are we worried mainly about sharing volumes, Derek? So one case I can think of is where a more privileged sidecar could come in, where we disable the user namespace for it. And the second is one where what you're talking about is where we want the all the sidecars to be in a separate user namespace, but still have access to the volumes in the pod.
Yeah. Correct.
Yeah, we haven't thought of that in the discussions so far.
Yes, I think the same applies to ephemeral containers. We have similar problems there.
There is a restriction in the Linux kernel if the different containers have the same network namespace, which is how Kubernetes works. Then if we want to share the network namespace, it's difficult to have a different user namespace for the different container of the same pod, because then /sys cannot be mounted. So that's I think that makes it impossible to have different container in the same pod to have different user namespace.
Okay, yeah, that'd be awesome if that's clarified in the CAP. I hadn't tied those two things together.
Right. Yes, I think there could be use cases for that, but from a technical point of view, I think this is quite difficult to implement right now. And this is already a complicated change to Kubernetes, and that will be things still more complicated. Okay, so if there are no any other questions, I will continue with this. I'm just going to finish. So Of course, we will have to extend the CRI to contain the mappings to use. I want to emphasize here that in our proposal, Kubernetes will be the one making the decision about what are the mappings to use. It means that the implementation in the different runtimes should be easy. At least we consider containerd and CRI-O, and this is easy to do there. There are some problems with Docker because Docker doesn't support containers with different ID mappings. So that's something that we will have to discuss. I don't know that there is a plan to deprecate Docker Chim. So yes, we will have to discuss with you in more details how to handle the Docker use case for this proposal. And this table is just summarizing the different modes we have in the pod spec and what is sent over the CRI. So basically the pods, the same pod with different non-overlapping mappings for each pod. The cluster is just seen as a pod mode with the same ID, with the same mapping for all the pods. And the host is just seen as node. And there is no any mapping in that case. Finally, we would like to tackle this problem in different phases. So we would like to try to iterate over the whole design to discuss the different nodes and define something like a long-term implementation for this. But for the implementation itself, we would like to propose implementing this in different phases. So for the phase one, we would like to introduce the host and the cluster modes. With this support, we provide some isolation, mainly host to pod. In this solution, we will support some hot volumes. And in the second phase, we aim to implement the pod mode where the stateless pods get these non-overlapping ID mappings. I welcome to any feedback. We have done some meetings with Red Hat internally, and we want to start discussing with the whole community. So it will be great if there are feedback on this. I think the next phase, the next task will be to open up to update the CAP with this new proposal and to do this discussion there. So I'm happy to answer any questions if there are any.
So I think the thing we need to figure out here is who can pick up the baton to re-shepherd this scenario. So in the past, we had Vika Scoutery that was working on this, and I was assisting, and we got far. And what you're presenting here is a slight variation on that past iteration. I'm wondering if there's anybody that would want to volunteer as like a primary reviewer on the CAP or potential approver.
I can do that, Derek, but I guess I've been working with them, so I'm not sure what the rules are, since I'm kind of closely iterating as this evolves.
I mean, I think that's fine. To me, I just want to make sure we have the right level of kernel and runtime awareness, right? So having experts review the work is the right thing. If anyone else wants to pair up with you or no, I think that'd be good. Just for level setting then, it seems like when you talked about phases, are we wanting to get agreement on a CAP in a 120 timeframe, or are you looking to make an iteration towards any one of those phases in this release?
Oh, sorry, I missed part of the question. I think, yes, the plan is, the ideal plan for us will be to get some into 120, but yes, we also know that this is a bit late for that. The problem here is that the whole implementation is quite big, but we also know that we should discuss the whole design first before going into the implementation of the first phase, because this is not possible to do the design for the first phase, implement that, and then start discussing the second one, because the design could change. So we have to define the design at the beginning and then start implementing in different phases.
Okay.
So I think like some of the, we wanted to do this initial presentations to just get a feeler for what SIG Node thinks of these fields and this overall approach. Like at least for the phase 2, we still have to figure out some of the details. Phase 1 seems clearer, but if there's any gotcha, like, hey, you can't do that, then it'll be good if we can get course corrected earlier before we start working on phase 1.
I know, Manal, you and I were talking a bit in the background, but like, I'm still trying to think through if there was any peculiarities around accounting for the image FS when this is enabled or not. So maybe some discussion in the KEP that talks about when and how remapping occurs when the image is pulled, and if having more than one pod reference the same image that uses a different user namespace mapping, if there's anything that we need to be aware of for that.
Right. Yeah. So I think that was one of my comments on the last iteration, and I think the way Albana, and you can correct me, containerd is pulling it to root, and there is a one-time cost to do the snapshot to a different user namespace root. Whereas like classically in Docker, we already had a different route in which you're pulling into. So on the cryo side, we still need to figure out how we want it handled. Like ideally, if we have the mapping already, then at pull time itself, we can just pull into the separate route. And then like any pods that start afterwards. Get it.
A different cost though?
Sorry, can you repeat?
What is the cost of performing that snapshot? Like if I have two containers running Nginx on a node, one says use host snap mapping, the other one says uses pod mapping. Is there a redundant cost for that Nginx image storage layer on the host?
So if they are using the same mapping, there is no cost, but whenever we use a different user namespace mapping, there's a one-time cost to chew on the files and make it available.
Yeah, so I think if we can clarify that when we're going through this, that would be useful.
Yep.
I mean, there's a cost in terms of choning, but there's also a cost in terms of disk space, right?
Yep.
It'll essentially duplicate the base image, right?
Right, exactly. So if the runtime knows the root, and at pull time itself, we are just creating that one root FS for an image. And if we know that it's never going to be used by root and it's only going to be used by the pod, then we can save that cost versus always pulling by root and then doing the one-time chown.
But that's assuming that any pod that uses it uses the same mapping, right?
Yeah, for the cluster mode, they'll all end up using the same mapping.
Okay, we're talking cluster mode.
Yeah, and the pod mode, it will be one-time cost per pod. Yeah, additional disk usage. Still, kernel has a solution.
Okay.
But that's exactly earlier what I tried to figure out, because for a given pod, they, based on what you say, that they may have the base image, and then it's kind of like based on what you just described, it's kind of cluster mode, right? So they all can share. But on top of that, when there's the delta built on top of those base images, then they become to like a pod mode. So that's why I don't know how we are going to manage that. So Manu, what you described, that's kind of the question what I have. And also this is all goes to like a mode, it goes to like the pod level, right? So, but at the pod level, you only have the one mode associated. So you end up user have to either choose cluster mode for everything, always have to choose the pod mode for everything.
I guess the thing on the pod mode that I was concerned about is like if we end up getting to a state where everyone runs pod mode and then everyone has an Istio sidecar container injected into their pod, and then the cost of that sidecar container is duplicated per container running on that host to do the remapping. that's the type of thing I was just trying to work out on what the gotchas were here, not particularly when you get to the pod mode. But I think the TLDR of this is the behavior of image garbage collection and image accounting is probably like the best area to explore next on this.
Yeah, I think the sidecar one is a good issue to be called out with the pod mode.
So sorry, maybe people already asked because earlier I couldn't hear anything. So what's the expectation for this release? I saw the face slide, but I couldn't hear anything.
So people like Kinwork would want to implement ideally the cluster mode, which is for phase 1. If we don't have any big issues with the overall design where we start implementing the phase 1 and we realize, oh no, we didn't think of a blocker which will prevent us from implementing phase 2 and the features down the line.
Shouldn't the host mode, it is basically just same behavior. So basically phase 1, we are kind of like looking into the host plus the cluster mode, right?
Yep. Yeah.
Got it. Thanks.
Yes.
Maybe we can follow up.
Yeah, if we can follow up, Myrna, if you want to take review on the CAP, that'd be great. And then it's going to require API review, so it will probably be a little bit longer. And then I do think the field should move to the pod security context, but that will save you one round of API review. And just make sure in the CAP we define what the feature gates are to enable this. And I think image garbage collection is the main thing I'm concerned about on this.
Okay. Yeah, I guess Mauricio and Rodrigo and Alban, we can work together and come back next week.
Sure. Thank you for your time.
Yes.
Yeah, sure. And thanks for the pointers. Very good points.
I may also have to recommend someone from the gvisor side to look into this one because they may have some potential compatible issue. So.
Okay.
Yeah, I was actually curious about the Kata as well. It seemed like Kata didn't really have a use case for host. And so if anyone on the call could represent the Kata community, that would be useful.
I'll need to look at it closer, but yeah, we don't do host networking if that's the question.
Just host user namespace support. So like it seemed like
I think there would be compatibility issues here at this point.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the Kata maybe it's okay because they are already hardening, and it's just certain mode that they just by default disable, not support. But for gvisor, it's because it's on the kernel and also it's on the host, the same host, so that maybe have the compatibility issue. So can someone send me? Do you have the email? Can share so I can introduce people and follow up with you offline. Of course, in discussing, we'll come back to the signal for discussing. But I just want to say like for efficiency perspective. So can you share with me your email address so I can introduce the people from the gvisor org?
Sure, I just sent my email there.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh,
thanks.
That's wrong. You're welcome.
Oh, there is a typo in the email, but we can share it on the Slack channel, on the SIG Node Slack channel.
Sure, thank you. Yeah. So let's move to next topic. So we can follow up on the offline on this one. So next one is the container image ID through the downward API. Yeah, we talk about this briefly.
Hi, my name is Mitar. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So it's my first time here, so I don't know really the process, but I opened this issue because I find it useful for containers to be able to report and log, ID and digest of what they are running, both for debugging and other purposes. For my personal case, it is reproducibility of scientific computation inside of job. So we want to report that and log that, what the exactly image was used. So I opened the issue, and the comment there suggested that I should go with more formal process to move it further. I'm not sure if it requires a cap or it's pretty straightforward in my view. But I'm bringing it here for any feedback, comments, or guidelines what to do next to move this further.
Yeah. So, is there a? I'm trying to think back if there's a historical enhancement that described downward API generally, given its history. But what was the use case that you'd want to know the image in the downward API?
I mean, the main idea is that the code running inside of a container should know what exactly the version of the code is running, and so and the easiest way for that is to report the Docker image, the jest or more generally image ID, and so then we can do that both to report to end users, which version of the code served your page. You can use this for logging. And in our particular use case is you can record it for scientific computation to record the version.
I'm trying to think like if I run in other runtimes, like can a Java application know what version of a jar file was given to it? Like I'm wondering the boundary there, and then can't SHAs vary across the images? I'm trying to think through more all the cases we run into where the value can differ. And I swear that we have one, but it's escaping me at the moment. So,
I mean, image ID is already available from outside, so you can log it from outside for I think all the same reasons. I don't see the reason why the internal application shouldn't know what is being run. I mean, it's just the question where you want to log. What is the use case here? Okay, so for example, if you want, you can imagine a website where in the footer of the website you want to show tell which version of the Docker image was served this request. And that's currently not possible, really. So for us, Docker image is the unit, not really just Git repo, but really what we want to reproduce exactly the particular Docker image and know which one was running something. And I think the image ID is the closest we have, and we just want to expose it internally.
But couldn't your image just include a file that says this is the version of my operating environment? Like,
no, it's a chicken and egg problem. Like if you're building the image, you don't know the hash of the image. You cannot include it in the image as you're building the image. Like you know it only after you made the image. So somehow you have to inject it back.
I'm still kind of missing. It feels like I don't. Maybe I'm alone on this though. I'm kind of missing like why the binary cares, right? Like the image defines my operating environment for my application, and when you package your image, if you had application specific versioning semantics, wouldn't you put that in your container image when building your image?
I mean, it's really okay. So it's really about reproducibility. So our personal use case here is we are doing science experiments. We want science reproducibility. So when you run a job where you get data in, where you want to run Docker image, if somebody wants to rerun those, they have to know which Docker image version you used. And so having digest ID allows, image ID allows them to pull exactly that Docker image. Having something internal does not map easily to what exactly Docker image they have to use to reproduce the thing. And so, you can log what was used, but it's not possible. Like, for example, I can store the git commit hash used to, build the Docker image and so on. But if somebody wants to rerun that, finding which Docker image included that git and exactly version, because it might be multiple Docker images built from the same git, but different other dependencies and so on, it's hard. So we already have a readily available way for both logging and also pooling, and that I think is the important thing here, is that having an image ID allows you to pull exactly the same version of the image later on again. And so that allows you to reproduce this and debug, or whatever use case you have. So for us, debugging and reproducibility is the main use case here.
So,
okay, so then maybe another way you could approach this is, can you just run 2 containers in your pod and then pass into the second container the image of the first container that you want to know that you were running? Like, why does this need to be a? Like, I'm kind of curious, one, if there's like a security isolation boundary we should think through on letting an application environment know which container image it was running from.
I mean, it's allowing it to know. It's allowing. It's not dormant API you have to enable. It's not that all images will now know. But if I want to know in my container how it, or what is being run, I'm able to configure it at the Kubernetes level. It's not that it's we are giving everyone this information.
Yeah. So maybe the next step on this would be to write a KEP that gives your use case and motivation in a little more detail, and then that would explain why, like, it needs to be generic to Kubernetes versus if it's specific to a particular class of pods you're creating, that you could pass this information in a container co-located to your primary container that said, this is the image I'm actually running.
I mean, it could be easier than that. We have something similar to this with when we build our operators, in that we pass in the operand image path to the operator as an environment variable. So like if you have something that's some template that's rendering out your deployments or whatever, you can just have the template render out the image and then copy that same value into an envar that you inject into your container, right?
Yeah, I mean, there are many workarounds here. I completely agree. I mean, the same holds for everything provided in Download API. So the whole point of Download API is that you don't do that. But yeah, Download API is the same thing. Like, if you want to pass, the amount of resources you're giving to the container, you can also use a template, and you can pass it as environment variable and copy the value from the resource field to the environment variable and so on. Here the idea here is really like not to have to repeat yourself, and that you minimize operation complexity here. And also the other issue here is that you don't really know exactly which version of the Docker image the Docker will the Kubernetes will pull. So you can specify image and tag, and then it pulls a particular version of it, and you cannot obtain that unless once it's running. You can, of course, exactly, use a Docker image with the whole digest as a link. But if you don't care in that exact moment, for which particular version is running, but you just say, use the latest tag. But when you use the latest tag, I want to know which one particularly you pull. Yes, so here it's really about being the only one knowing which version it is.
Okay, okay. Mita and Derek, can we follow up through the KEP? Yeah. I like the proposal to make the KEP capture all the use cases, and I know all the use cases described here. Actually, people have the workaround, so we can carry discussing there. So that's more organized, and we also don't have the 6 minutes. We have so many topics, and I haven't go through yet. So can we carry on that one? So Mika, thanks for the proposal, and please send us the cap. We will carry on our discussing there.
Sure.
Thank you. Yeah. So let's move to the next topic. We don't have much time. So Renaud, do you want to talk about like the pod, the resource API?
Sure. Since we don't have much time, I won't present the KEP, but I will talk about it very quickly. The KEP that is linked in the notes is really just a reformat of the existing KEP to the new process. What is here discussed is moving from beta to V1. So this is a feature that's been in beta since 1.15. It's been used in production by a number of customers. And overall, the work that would just be remaining to, at least in our opinion, move from beta to V1 is really create the V1 API and maybe add a small metric and make sure that the gRPC config option are set in such a way that they don't allow abuse. But that's really what this KEP is about, or what this PR is about. So I'd be happy to get some comment from people. If we can include it as part of the feature milestone, 1.20 milestone, that would be, if people are okay, that would be also the next step.
Okay, I will take a look on this one, and I believe we already talked about this one. We all agree, and we'll look at the detail. I know that David Dashboard also still on this one as the reviewer. Yeah. So yeah, we can move on for the next one. So we can carry on this one offline. And please, everyone, if interested on this one, please review this one. And next one, it is memory management cap.
Yeah, so I had reviewed this. The main issue I was hitting on this, just to summarize, was one, wanting to have better metrics on knowing if the actual feature is functioning as designed. So if the kubelet could report its node local topology view and some understanding on how pods were bound to it, that would be useful as a person trying to investigate the system. The other one was, and this is too long of a topic to dive into here, but we've been exploring issues around kernel memory accounting. And Mernal and Seth and myself could probably talk in some more detail, but since this tries to further elevate what it means to be guaranteed memory, particularly to users that expect ever and ever greater guarantees, I wanted to poll the community on if there was any guidance for how people did C group K memory accounting. Because what we see at Red Hat is that the charges per C group can vary depending on the number of CPU threads available to that container. And so just accounting for that when we provide ever and ever greater accounting guarantees in the kubelet is, I felt like something we should define as part of a node spec on this is what the Kubernetes community recommends for setting cgroup.kmem. But it's a deeper topic, but for those that want to look at it, please review the KEP and some of the bugzillas that at least we've been exploring at Red Hat. Anything you want to add on that, Mernal or Seth?
No.
Nope.
Like maybe I want to add something because the bugzilla that you specify, it's a lot of comments, it's under private sections. So if you out the Reddit, probably you will not see it. So
no, the pertinent comment was public on that bugzilla, which was the case lab accounting based on CPU threads. So
okay.
No one needs to read the internal analysis of how we ultimately found these new issues. But in general, I think if we can come back on like a recommendation on how to set up cgroup.kmem when using this feature is kind of the main thing with calling out.
Yeah, for sure. And like I asked, let's discuss it on the next week because it's a really interesting topic because it's really only can be related to the hardware topology, and it's like it also can be related to the system calls, to the specific system calls if you initiate it. So yeah.
So next
All right,
one,
so we can do a deeper dive on that next week. Yeah, we'll move on to the next one.
cool. So next one, it is the node shutdown cap, and I volunteer myself to take a look at that one. Anyone else want to also review? Please take a look at that one. This one also been talked about for many times and come back many times and driving by SIG storage initially, and then finally we have the SIG Node. People really own those things, and please take a look on that one. So David, you want to talk about more on that one too?
Yeah, thanks, Don. Since we don't have a lot of time, I'll just go over it very briefly. So this is a new cap that me, Murnal put up. So the idea here is that Kubelet should kind of be aware of the underlying machine shutdown and be able to actually capture that event, and during the machine shutdown actually terminate pods gracefully, because currently when a machine shuts down, all the pods are just kind of deleted by the underlying init system and they're just killed. So pre-stop hooks and sig term and all that stuff is not honored. So this is kind of the proposal here. We can go into more details next meeting, but I would appreciate anyone who's interested to take an initial look and provide some feedback.
So we have an Windows, privileged Windows, and the last time I think that also is because last time I ran out of time, and so can we make at least next week? This is the first topic to talk about.
So we did raise this with SIG auth, and they didn't have any problems. I think we can talk about this next week, but would we be able to get anybody to take a look at the KEP before next week, so we have enough time to kind of react to feedback before the
I put a number of
proposal? I saw Derek was taking a look at it already.
Yeah, I had a number of comments on there, particularly around like just wanting to clarify. It seemed like there's a discrepancy in the behavior versus what the pod spec shows. And so the more we could do to make what the pod spec shows map the actual user behavior was the main gist of my feedback. And I haven't seen if that's been addressed yet, but yeah, I tried to be proactive on getting review for you there.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think we did address a number of those comments. But yeah, I think moving to next week is fine. I'm just worried that we won't have enough time if we discuss next week to be able to reach a consensus by the 6th.
Okay, so I will move to next week and call out for everyone to take a look at the doc. And there are other things like the container notifier cap. I think maybe just call out for the reviewer. And Sergey, you have the couple questions and certain things maybe people can answer through this meeting notes. Is that okay? Because we ran out of the time right now.
Yeah. So there is a cap that we discussed in one of the previous meetings about timeouts. It would be really great if it's very simple. It's one pager, and it would be great if we can approve it. And then runtime class, we have a document collecting all the feedback. So if you want to read it, then I think we need to start moving runtime class into GA as well. Yeah, comments is fine. Thank you.
Sergey, I'll review the runtime class one with Murnal if you'd like.
Thank you.
One final call out. So we are planning to have a CRI alpha to beta transition meeting, and it looks like it's going to be tomorrow, 11 to 12 Pacific time. So I'll just post an update to the thread I started on SIG Node yesterday.
Sure. Yeah, thanks. So thank you, everyone. And sorry we cannot cover so many topics today. So looking forward to talk to everyone and follow up offline, and looking forward to talk to everyone next week. Thanks.
Thank you, folks.